We're in the 26th chapter of Acts. We're continuing our study in Acts. And we remember that last week Paul was giving a defense, and he was interrupted in the defense of what he believed and where he stood, etc. And you'll remember in verse 25, Festus, or in verse 24 rather, Festus had shouted with a loud voice, "You're mad, Paul. You're crazy. You're beside yourself." And Paul answered that, and he said, "I am not mad, most noble Festus." We spoke about or thought about the idea that Festus addresses him really in a kind of an ugly way, but Paul showed him due respect for the office that he held and as a human being. And so he said, "Festus, but I speak forth the words of truth and soberness." And notice he called him noble Festus. And that brings us to verse 26. "For the king knoweth of these things, before whom also I speak freely. For I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, for this thing was not done in a corner." So Paul is continuing to answer Festus in a way, but he's addressing his remarks instead to King Agrippa, and yet Festus is listening to this. So Festus has claimed that Paul was insane because of much learning. And we've all known somebody that became so knowledgeable in some area and they let it go to their heads, and next thing you know, they're spewing forth all kinds of nonsense. When we look around us today, we can see quite a bit of that in some of our major colleges that are supposed to be so great. And some of the things they're telling, for instance, the idea that, well, you can be born a woman, but you can pretend you're a man and you really are a man, or vice versa. So this is not something that's new. It's been going on probably ever since close to the beginning of time. Paul said, "For the king Agrippa knoweth these things." Paul was showing that because he was not aware, that is, Festus was not aware of the things that he talked about, the resurrection, that didn't mean that other people didn't know about them and believe in such. Doesn't mean that it wasn't true. Just because a person doesn't believe something, there are still people on this earth that believe in America that the world is flat. That just amazes me. We haven't been to the moon, even though it was documented. It's amazing what people will cause themselves to believe because they want to believe it. It needs to be remembered, too, that the Herodian family, in order to placate the Jews, observed the outward show of the law of Moses. They went to all of the feast days and they proclaimed all of these things. But deep down inside, they were no more followers of the law of Moses than was the Sanhedrin as a whole. Agrippa knew the law, and he knew the hopes of Israel for a Messiah. And when you look at Bernice, his wife, she was truly more religious than he was and claimed to be a Jew as well. He continues in that context and says, "Before whom also I speak freely." Paul uttered words freely. The word freely comes from laleo, and it means to be frank in utterance. In other words, he wasn't just talking. He's being very blunt. He's being straightforward. He's speaking the truth. Zojates gives us a little more understanding, I should say, of this word, and he says to speak openly, boldly, and without constraint. So Paul is telling Agrippa and Festus, I'm going to talk bluntly to you. I'm going to I've not got no restraints on me whatsoever. Now, you think about that. Remember, Paul was a prisoner of the Roman government right now. People had been trying to get him tried and convicted of some crime that would cause him to be put to death. But he said, I'm going to speak without constraint. I'm going to speak openly. You're going to hear the truth, in other words. Thayer tells us it means to use freedom in speaking. And all of these definitions by these Greek lexicons, boy, come on, Bob, get it right. Lexicographers are interesting to help us to better understand what was being said. Further, Paul said, I'm persuaded, now listen to this, that none of these things are hidden from you. You who? Agrippa. Agrippa, he's saying, I know you know about the hopes of the Jews, of a Messiah who would come and who would establish a kingdom. And remember, Agrippa's father, his grandfather, and his uncle all persecuted Christ and the disciples. This was an extremely evil family. Jesus' crucifixion and what he Agrippa, or rather Festus, would have called a rumor of Jesus' resurrection was a matter of public record. You know, the Bible being based on truth, these things can be checked out. Was there a man named Jesus? Yes. Does somebody other than the Bible record the fact that there was a man named Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah, who was crucified? Yes. And all of the place names that we see, all of these, and all of the titles. It hasn't been too many years ago when people would say, oh, you know, that old, oh, come on, Bob. No, well, the Hittites, but I was thinking the title, Pilate. The title of Pilate, oh, no, he couldn't have been governor then, and there was no such office as that. Well, guess what? The archaeological spade dug it up. And I'm so happy for the archaeological spade. It has proven over and over and over again that every claim the Bible has made about a particular place or title or whatever it is, slowly but surely comes to light and proves that they were all there. By the way, a bit of, I think, is good news. There's an organization that keeps track of all book sales in the United States. Have I told you all that before? Not you, Jenny. Have y'all, did I tell you all this before? Good. Something new. But they keep track of all book sales. Last year, this year, the first 10 months of this year, book sales in the United States, that is physical books, was up 2%. Not very much, is it? But, you know, when you look at the volume, it's a lot. But Bible sales in this country for the first 10 months, we don't know the last two, for the first 10 months of this year, we're up 24%. And I don't know how they know this, but they said that a lot of that increase is due to first-time buyers of a Bible. That means there are people out there that somehow are beginning to realize there's a need for this book. There's a need for my life and something that will help me in this book. And I think that's extremely good news. But let's get back to our subject. Why would Agrippa know or have knowledge of these things? And again, Paul said this thing wasn't done in a corner. In other words, it's very public. The word corner here means an internal corner. In other words, something that's inside. And so it'd be the inside corner of, say, a square. It wasn't done in a secret place, the corner. Jackson made an interesting comment here. He said, the Christian religion is not a secluded esoterical system. It is grounded in real history. It is checkable. And he's absolutely right. All of these places. And when we get a little further in the book of Acts in chapter 27, we're going to see name after name of ports and places. A call where Paul is going to be on that ship and going to different places. It can all be checked out. They may not have the same name as they have now, but the history books will show that the name that they have now referred to the name that's found in the Bible. In John 18 and verse 20, I spake openly to the world. This is Jesus speaking. He said, I spoke openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogues and in the temple. Now notice that. Jesus says, when I was walking around before they crucified him, and shortly before they crucified him, he said, I did this openly. The whole world was my pedestal, so to speak. I ever taught in the synagogue, in the temple. And the Jews always were resorting to these places. And in secret, he said, I have done or said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them that heard me. The Jews had been asking Jesus, why are you doing, how are you doing it? Why are you doing this? Who gave you the authority? He said, ask those who heard me. Oh, who was that? The Jews. What Jews? The ones who went to the temple, who heard him speak there often. The ones who went into the synagogues, heard him speak often. They know what I said. Remember, because of Agrippa's knowledge, the Romans had placed him in charge of the temple. A non-Jew, he was an Idumean, which is also very interesting if you look at history. But he was an Idumean. He wasn't a Jew. And he had never converted to Judaism. He just pretended to follow the law of Moses. The Romans had taken him and placed him in charge of the temple. Imagine that. And the Jews let it happen. Look at verses 27 and 28 with me, if you will. Excuse me. Watch what Paul does here. Really the Holy Spirit. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. Paul speaking by inspiration. And what a question he's just asked King Agrippa in the form, from this audience, before this audience. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Agrippa had come from a family which had tried to murder John the Immerser, murdered Jesus and the Apostle James, and tried to murder the baby Jesus. MacArthur made an interesting statement here. Paul's shrewd question put Herod in a dilemma. You ever hear about, we use the term between a rock and a hard place. In other words, it doesn't matter, you're going to get squished. He's put him in this position. If he affirmed his belief in the prophets, he would also have to admit that what they taught about Jesus' death and resurrection was true. An admission that would make him appear foolish before his Roman friends, and yet to deny the prophets would outrage his Jewish subjects. You can just, do you believe the prophets? He didn't say, did you believe in Jesus? He said, do you believe the prophets? And by doing that, he's put Agrippa in a real difficult position. Either way he goes, he's in trouble. It's almost like the question that you could ask somebody and say, have you stopped beating your mate? Yes or no? Well, if you say yes, that means you were beating them before. If you say no, it means that I haven't stopped and I'm still beating them. That's the kind of question that Paul has asked. Paul didn't give Agrippa a chance to deny this question or in any way. Look at him. By inspiration, he said, I know that thou believest. There was absolutely no doubt in his mind. He knew that Herod Agrippa the first believed in the prophets. And to believe in the prophets means you had to believe what they said. A Messiah was coming, like Moses. Well, how was it that this Messiah was like Moses? He was going to be a lawgiver, just as God chose Moses to deliver the law that we call the law of Moses to the Jews. Only Jesus is going to give the final law, the law of Christ, Christianity. He also would have had to have believed that the Messiah was going to usher in a kingdom. He didn't understand what that kingdom was, as did most of the Jews. In fact, even the apostles, if you look at Acts chapter 1, they still didn't understand that it was a spiritual kingdom compared to a physical kingdom. They are now talking to or have witnessed a resurrected Christ. And shortly before he's taken back to heaven, they ask him, are you now going to usher in your kingdom? To me, there appears to be an implication in what's being said. Paul is, I think, implying, since you believe the prophets, why don't you become a Christian? You know that Jesus was crucified. You know his claims. You've been living in this area. You're not blind. Oh, and take into, again, the fact that Agrippa had been placed by the Romans over the affairs of the temple. He knew exactly what had taken place. But look at the sad response of Agrippa. Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. How sad that someone came so close, but at the last minute turns away. I think it's interesting to notice how this is translated in some of the other versions. In the American Standard Version of 1901, with but little persuasion thou wouldest fain make me a Christian. In Campbell's rendition translation, he says, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. Young's literal translation, in a little thou dost persuade me to become a Christian. The New American Standard Bible says, in a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian. All of them give this sense of Agrippa being on the verge of becoming a Christian, but he backs away. Some have read this as, you have not shown me enough reason to become a disciple of Jesus. I don't think that translation would even begin to represent what's being said here. He's saying, in effect, you almost convinced me to be a Christian. Agrippa, indeed, was almost persuaded. But Agrippa was unwilling to follow the example of one whom he venerated, and that is Moses himself. When we look at Hebrews 11, verse 25 through 27, we see how Moses was much different than Agrippa. Agrippa seemed to understand and come close to accepting the transition that he would have had to have made in becoming a Christian. Moses embraced it, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, and he endured as seeing him who is invisible. When Moses learned the truth, he immediately grabbed hold of it. Agrippa didn't. You know, we sing a song sometimes, the third stanza, if I remember, it's the third stanza, I think it is, of that song, Almost Persuaded. Listen to it. Almost persuaded, harvest is past. Almost persuaded, doom comes at last. Sad, sad, that bitter wail, almost, but lost. That's Agrippa. Look at verse 29 with me. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. This shows Paul's great desire. When we look into the book of Romans, he was ready to consider or to lose his own soul if he could get others, if it were possible. Of course, that wasn't possible. He wanted everyone to be saved. He wanted everyone who heard him to be, as he was, a Christian. But he didn't want them to be prisoners like he was at that time. Saved, but hopefully not a prisoner like he was. Notice verse 30 through 32. And when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice, and they that sat with them. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, This man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, This man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. So Agrippa, Bernice, and Festus, they had what we might call a little powwow. They go off to the side and they are discussing what they've heard and why Paul is still a prisoner, and they agreed that Paul had done nothing worthy of death. He had done nothing worthy of imprisonment. So why was Paul still a prisoner? And now notice, we might be tempted to say it was because of that old spineless Festus, the governor before, or Felix. I'm getting them mixed up in my head. Felix, right? First one? Yeah. Before Festus. Okay, now I got it right. Felix, he could have released Jesus. He had the report of the centurion from Jerusalem, the centurion of centurions, that he was worthy of nothing, not of death or anything, and hadn't broken any Roman rules. So why didn't Felix let him go? Well, we'd say, well, he was spineless and he wanted money, and he thought he could bribe, Paul into getting money for him, and then he'd let him go. We could claim it on that, but that's not the real answer as to why Paul was still a prisoner. The real answer is in order to fulfill God's plan for Paul to go to Rome. Paul is a prisoner because he had angered the Jews, which God knew he would when he stood and told them the truth. And now he had been sent to Caesarea, and Felix had kept him as a prisoner, and when he left, he wanted to give something to please the Jews. Well, why did he want to try and please the Jews? Because the Jews had raised such a fuss about him in Rome that Roman Emperor Nero had called him back from his appointment and appointed another governor, Festus, to rule in his place. And eventually, Felix, remember, was convicted by Nero and banished to what we call Spain today. See, the real answer is he was still a prisoner because this was God's way, providentially, to get him to Rome, which Paul wanted to do in the first place, didn't he? Look at chapter 27 and verse 1 and 2. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. One Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. There are a number of interesting things here. The day finally comes for Paul to begin his journey to Rome. We might say that he actually began that journey in Jerusalem, or we might even go back to Caesarea, where he went from there to Jerusalem. But the final day came for now the final journey to begin. Now you remember in Romans chapter 15, a letter that was written approximately 4 years before the time of our text. In Romans 15, 30 through 32, Paul had asked the brethren, had expressed his desire to be with the brethren in Rome, and had also asked them to pray for him that he would be able to come to them. His prayer is being answered. The journey began at the seaport of Adramyttium, and Paul was placed under the charge of a centurion named Julius. Now, consider that the text tells us that Julius belonged to Augustus's band. Now, that's not speaking about drums and bugles and all that stuff. He wasn't in that kind of a band. This was talking about a specialized group of men. They were extremely trained bodyguards for the emperor, and they were called the Augustus band. That's what he was a part of. Now, wait a minute. The emperor wasn't, Nero wasn't in this area of the world. What was he doing there? We would compare the bodyguards, this Augustus band today, to the Secret Service guards around the President of the United States. They are extremely talented people. They have been trained in the most difficult circumstances known. Why was he here at this time, this centurion? We don't know. We're not given the answer. It might have been he was on TDY. It may have been that he was there for a special mission for Nero. We don't know what the answer is, but somehow he is in Caesarea when this all starts. And Paul is placed under his authority. What that means is that he's now responsible for Paul. If Paul escapes, the centurion dies. That was Roman law. If he allowed him to be mistreated, he's going to pay the price, the centurion will. And as we'll see, Julius treated Paul extremely well during this journey, even following Paul's instructions at times. Now notice someone else that's mentioned there, a man named Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. Notice the specifics are given to us. I think there's a reason for that. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. I believe this is the same Aristarchus that we see earlier in the book of Acts. The one that was taken to the theater by the mob at Ephesus in Acts 19:29. One of the 7 that was helping Paul to take an offering to Jerusalem from the Gentile churches in Acts 20 and verse 4. Paul's fellow prisoner, as he's designated in Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24. He may have also been a prisoner at this very time with Paul under the authority of Julius on their way to Rome. It's possible that he was a prisoner. Tradition says that Aristarchus was martyred during Nero's administration. Again, look at how all this fits together. A Macedonian of Thessalonica. Where was the Aristarchus that we noticed earlier from? Thessalonica. Look at verse 3. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. They sailed from Caesarea to Sidon. This is about 70 miles from Caesarea. Julius, notice, courteously entreated Paul. What does that mean? Why did Julius treat Paul so well? Was he at the trial and was impressed by Paul? Don't know. It would have been a place where he probably would have been, and when we consider the degree of high society that had been invited to hear him, along with Agrippa and Bernice and Festus. Was he given maybe special instructions by Festus to treat Paul well because of his Roman citizenship? Did maybe Julius have some sympathies toward Christianity? Because we know in later writings that some of Nero's own household were converted. And remember how they used the word household in those days. That would have included his imperial guard, those who guarded Paul. We don't know the answer, but we do know the word courteously. That word comes from the Greek word philanthropos, and we get our word philanthropy from it. And that's interesting. The American Standard translates this word kindly. Campbell's translation of this says great humanity. Treated him with great humanity. Treated him kindly. Strong says that this original word, philanthropos, means fondly of man that is humanly courteous. He treated him very well. He treated him like men should be treated, no matter who they are, no matter what position they are, no matter what language they speak. It doesn't matter. Julius gave him liberty. To do what? To go to his friends, and notice the term, to refresh himself. Obviously, this liberty would have been conditional. There would have at least been a soldier who accompanied Paul as he went to be refreshed by his friends. He was probably chained to one of the soldiers. There may have been several soldiers. We know that this liberty had to be conditional because, again, Julius was responsible for whatever happened to the Apostle Paul. Now look at that word refresh. Epimelia, care, attention. Brown, Driver, and Brown. It's brought about two speculations about what that means. Some believe that it means that Paul needed some kind of medical attention that was needed. Others believe that it's talking about him receiving fresh clothing and provisions for the trip. Remember that a Roman prisoner was many times subject to the whims of his jailers, and he may not have been fed as well as he could. He had to depend upon someone who was a friend to bring him clothing, food, and other things, essentials. So we don't know exactly what it means, but my guess would be more that it revolved around giving him a chance to clean up, get fresh clothing, and things that he needed for this trip. This was not going to be a day trip. It's going to take a little bit of time. Imagine, if you will, the encouragement. that Paul would have gotten from being able to spend some time with his brethren. You know, the highlight of my week is always to be able to go to Jackson and preach to the brethren there. I think I can speak for Jenny. That's the same way she feels. That's our highlight. That's our church family. But it's also part of our highlight to come here on Wednesday night and be with our, what would we call it, maybe our substitute family or whatever. That's the highlight of my week, is to be able to spend time with my brethren. Look at verse 4 and 6, and that's the way it should be for all of us. Look at verses 4 through 6. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. Notice what we see here. Why are we told they sailed south of Cyprus, that is, under Cyprus, after leaving Sidon? Because the winds were contrary. The word contrary comes from enanteos, and Strong tells us it means opposite, figuratively antagonistic. Because the winds were antagonistic. Thayer tells us that it means opposed as an adversary. Same idea, is just a little better understanding gives us when we look at all of them. Because the winds were our adversary, they were opposed to us. They kept us, in other words, from going the way we wanted to go. So whatever this other route was, the winds had caused them to take a different route than what they had intended to do. And it's hard for our modern minds to really understand their difficulty. Because in our modern minds, we think of the massive ships that we have now with powerful motors and able to push them through a great storm. But in those times, their ships were almost totally controlled by the winds. They could only do so much. They could only turn so much. Even with a good rudder and the mast up, they could only do so much. And if the winds were their adversaries, pushing against them in a way that pushed them a different way than they wanted to go, they only had so much that they could do. When we think about some of our sailboats today that these people get out in and have these contests in, we see them able to turn the mast to help guide those boats. But they didn't have that ability. They could only go one way. And that's the way the wind pushed them. If it was pushing with them, it billowed out the sails and they went forward. If it pushed the opposite way, it billowed the sails in as much as possible and usually would tear them up and would push them the opposite way. And we might remember that the Cretans had been at first in Pentecost. We're going to see them in just a moment, when the church was established in Acts 2 in verse 11. And further, Paul had labored at Crete. We're going to see Crete show up in our text in Titus 1 and verse 5. So after sailing over the seas of Cilicia and Pamphylia, they came to a port called Myra. And in Myra, this port obviously was a pretty big one because they had seagoing ships. The ship that Paul had been on up to this point was what was called a coastal ship. They couldn't sail out into the middle of the Mediterranean. They would end up being sunk. So they would follow along the coastline to get to where they were going and just be able to venture out a little bit into the Mediterranean. But Julius finds a ship that was out of Alexandria, Egypt, and this ship is a seagoing ship. It's able to venture out into the Mediterranean, and there were a lot of ships that were, their home port was Alexandria, Egypt. Why? Because the Romans had gotten where they depended on the grain from Egypt to feed their people in Rome. It's an interesting fact about history. It got to the point where the citizens of Rome couldn't feed themselves without all of these ships coming in from all of these other places. So they had to conquer, and they conquered Egypt. Julius found this ship from Alexandria, and all of these grain ships were coming, and he took Paul and the others that were prisoners with him and transferred them to this ship from Alexandria. But this ship was not the problem. The wind was the problem. Just because they'd gotten into a bigger ship wasn't going to make it easier for them. It appeared so for a moment, but that moment soon passed. I couldn't help but think that many marriage partners have tried a new ship over the years with the same results that we're going to see coming up. Look at verse 7 and 8. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cretus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone. And hardly passing it, came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. Why were they sailing slowly? Because of their adversary, the wind. They couldn't move as quickly as that ship under other circumstances would have been able to move. The wind was their adversary, pushing them where they didn't want to go. And notice it says they reached a place called Fair Havens. This was a port, again, it was a smaller port, but still large enough to hold a seagoing ship close to the city of Lasea. Well, you know what? We need to go ahead and stop. We'll come back to 9 through 11. Hope you'll read those things and read those passages we looked at, and look at how they connect with all that's going on and the things that we've tried to learn from the difficulties that we're facing with regard to the wind, etc. But we'll come back next week and look at verses 9 through 11.